All right. An Orthodox Christian, an agnostic, and an atheist walk into a podcast. This is their story. Welcome back to the Book Wave, the book club podcast. If you're new around here, check out our website at www.bookwave.club. Today we're joined by Matt, an old-time member of the podcast, Will, as usual, and I'm your host, Scott. I have an open question for the audience and the both of you. What does the Bible, or more specifically, the book of Genesis, mean to you? Matt, why don't you start us off?
All right. For me, the Bible is not a story to sit next to the bed with and fall asleep to. I also don't think it's a psychological plunge into the depths of our consciousness. I don't think it's anything that, this is my word, pretentious. I think it's there literally to make liturgies for us. So, for example, the first 7 days of creation, I don't think it's talking about nuclear physics. I think what it's doing is it's taking the metaphysical question we are bound to ask at many points in our lives for different reasons, and it actually puts the mystery in the poem and shows the mystery in the poem. But it doesn't get it right, because if it got it right, there wouldn't be a chapter 2, which is very symmetrical to it and basically tells the same story. And so with chapter 3 and chapter 4, all the way to the New Testament, all the way to Revelation, and then a lot of monks and priests and I would say postmodern writers are doing the same thing. So I have a really big, broad view of the Bible that almost makes it not a sacred text in and of itself. But I'm sure we'll explore that all together today.
I like that answer. I'm not sure it's what I expected, but I like it a lot.
That's definitely not what I expected.
How about you, Will?
And yet I still think what I said is consistent with orthodoxy. And so this little nugget of glimmering paradox becomes the norm. And I think that can be used as a intellectual virtue signal card, or it can be from the heart. And best way to see which one it is just to sharpen one another up in dialogue. So I really look forward to hearing what you say, Will, and if you want to go next.
I think I'll probably be needling you on the finer points of orthodoxy later on, but as far as Genesis is concerned in the Bible on whole, and for me especially, like I went to church as a child, and since I have gone on my own personal exploration of spirituality and what that means to me, and I have not found any answers, thus the agnosticism. And so like getting into the Bible, for me, it's a check mark on a long list of books that really shaped the world. And had I not been able to expose myself to these things, I think I'd be missing just some valuable information. And so going into Genesis, a lot like going into Iliad, was like humbling and breaking down those walls of pretense that I expected, and just reading Genesis was like, oh, again, a bunch of words, and they're in a sequence of sentences, and I kind of follow along, and a whole ton of names. And for me, it's like I already know probably 10 times more than what I knew a week ago about the Bible, and I'm still so ignorant that I don't even want to form opinions, because it's like we've got Jacob's Ladder and the Technicolor Dreamcoat and all these things that I watched in the VeggieTales 20 years ago. I'm like, oh, okay, I know that part, I follow this part, but then there's other stuff where I'm reading and I'm like, what? This is written? And they're telling this to children? He did what with whose handmaids? So like we're still on the ascent of the very beginning of this ride, and it's eye-opening and it's enlightening and baffling all at the same time. I don't know if that tells you anything about my opinion.
Yeah, I can relate to that a little bit, but I didn't just read the Bible in preparation of this podcast. I actually read Isaac Asimov's Guide to the Bible. Well, the Genesis chapter in a way. And it was talking about all like the names that you're talking about, all the genealogies, and like talking about that as a representation of just all the tribes in the area, and how it wasn't talking about specific people, but he claims them to be eponyms of the tribes of like that area of the world. Most of them pagans or polytheists. That was pretty
If I
cool.
can just throw in really quickly something that I'm going to say. So with all these names and the genealogy and similar in the Iliad with all of the troops that show up, like
Yeah.
for me, experiencing writing of that style as someone who dabbles in game development and has played video games his whole life, I'm looking at these first couple chapters and I'm saying, wow, they're building an entire world and they're painting fine details in really large, broad strokes. Whereas to get that many people's names in World of Warcraft, you'd have to put in several hundred hours and you'd know their names and you'd understand their stories and you get all this lore. But when you read it in a book, it's like you got to put down all these names right away and then for the next 2,000 pages fill in all these stories and details that would be major quest lines and side quest lines in these big stories that for me are the ones that I was experiencing my life outside of religion.
Yeah.
That's very interesting because it plays with time. So, for example, with a video game, there's the profit motive, and it's a present motive, and it's aware of its audience and the limit of the relationship it can have with the audience. So we're going to pool the resource of the knowledge, a bunch of game developers, and we're going to build up scenery, and we're going to do our graphics right and get the physics just so, and the mini quests as nuanced as would be adequate to get that person playing maybe for 5 months until we can then, without being too invasive in their wallet, offering an upgrade at some dollar price. Now, projecting into the future, 5 months, 6 months, 1 year, next 10 years, recycling the game with little improvements is what I would call preparing for the liturgy. So you create your audience and then you got to take care of them. And in order to do that, you have to massage their needs, their psychologies, their motor activities, basically get in their day-to-day without micromanaging it. And so a light touch over the long term. And I think video games really have begun to manifest that awareness, because back in the day with the N64, you had something as simple and self-contained as GoldenEye, right? That was a self-contained game. Multiplayer, you could still play today without changing a thing and have a hell of a time. Still, it's radically fun. But there's no world because there's no liturgy, I would say.
Not as many characters as the Bible.
Precisely. So then all of that was to say, all right, that's creating liturgies for the present moment, according to the bottom line. But I think when you look at something such as the Iliad or the story of Abraham, you get a big question mark. Were these worlds developed to engage the audience over the long term, or was there already something engaging them that then long after the culture lost its vitality, did these things get written down? And now we look at the relics of that vital culture the same way we would look at a book at Barnes and Noble, this complete thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I approach the issue of canonicity. Like some fundamentalist Christians will lose friends and marry or not marry over whether or not someone says that the Bible, with its certain number of books at Barnes and Noble next to the Message, is the inspired word of God or it's not. I mean, people buy rings over this sort of. binary. And
Yeah.
I was that way. I thought that way. And I wonder why I thought that way. I think part of it had to do with something in the air that reduced complexity down to a simple thing that I thought I could get my hand around. But it had no liturgy. Because once you get someone on board answering that question, yeah, it's the inspired word of God. Okay, we agree, but now what? There's no liturgy baked into that. I don't know what to do next. I don't know what to do next year. I don't even know why I should go on living, right? It becomes an existential crisis sooner than later. And so a lot of people spend a lot of time after answering their question dealing with the doubt that keeps uprising because it doesn't have the baked in liturgies.
Yeah, I think it helps
It's not a playable, one last thing, it's not a playable game, to bring it back around. It doesn't become a playable game.
I think it helps to look at the Bible as a library of books or a collection instead of just one solid story from front to back. Like the church has split over like the thousands of years since the start. It's split however many times because they disagreed over a couple books or a couple pages of the Bible. Like the reason we have Catholicism and Orthodoxy is because, you know, they don't agree with each other. I think kind of goes against the overarching theme or goal of Christianity is to unite the world. But it just kind of, no matter how hard we try to create a symbol of religion to unite everybody, it just ends up fracturing more than anything else.
I do think, though, there is something radically subversive about the narrative techniques in both the Old and the New Testament, which may lay the red carpet, I hate to say it this way, but the red carpet of blood for future schisms. And if I'm being honest, I have to admit those contradictions are baked into the narrative choices. So, for example, the New Testament, many people look at as a benign document in comparison to all the wars and bloodshed and sacrifice your son narratives in the Old. But if you read it line by line, the New Testament is full of triggers and micro traps for someone who would take it seriously. I mean, put yourself in the original audience. Caesar is God. He's the empire builder. We have this wonderful way to travel the world and to go places in relative safety, so rather efficiently. We get there quickly, almost as if we're moving by fiber optics. The fiber optics of that time was the Roman roads. So there was a lot to be thankful for. And then this person comes along and says, we're not going to do anything about that, but there is this kingdom of heaven, which makes no sense if you decompose that sentence. I mean, where is heaven and what does the kingdom look like? He doesn't answer either one. And the people who were supposed to follow him come to him and say, okay, you're the Messiah, the one who's supposed to open up the books from our past, the Old Testament, and make it so that we can't help but see the truth. So do that. And he talks about birds and seed and dirt, and then walks away like an enigma. And then his disciples ask him questions, and he uses, what's the word? What's that word that starts with an S when people are suspicious, but what's that word? Yeah. If you're afraid of Friday the 13th and walking under ladders, what's that word called?
Oh, superstitious.
Thank you.
That was a fun game.
Very superstitious.
Writing on the wall. So instead of talking about the birds and the seed, he talks about the devil taking away the good grain and sowing some weeds. If you look at those stories together, you see that he's telling parables to his disciples too. He's just changing the words. So it's this double-faced movement that trips a lot of people, and it's intended to trip people up, which is, and then the final head on the nail in John's gospel, the people come and say, just open up the book to us, and he says, you'll search it all day long. You'll wear out your eyes, your body will become emaciated, but you search in vain because they all point to me. And then they're just like, well, then what are we supposed to do about that? And he says, eat me alive. We're not supposed to do that. The Old Testament says, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You shall not raise up your hand against another human being. What, I mean, are you a snake? Like, no wonder people were so offended. It was subversive. And yet it's encased in Christianity and foundational. Now that contradicts what I was trying to put out earlier with respect to the liturgies, because how do you build a liturgy on this kind of contradiction? And I honestly don't know yet. I suspect we'll all find out together.
Well, you swam several kilometers ahead of me, and I am now out of my depth. But you've got me thinking. I can't speak to New Testament because I have no research, no experience. I've never touched that. But for me, I think with Genesis, there's questions that like humanity has to ask, and one of those questions is, where did we come from? Who were our ancestors? What did they get up to? And I think that human nature is curious. And I think another big component is that humans like belief, and they have a very hard time with belief. They have this very confusing relationship with belief, but they like to feel hopeful and they like to feel belief, and they need systems. And like purely speculatively speaking, I'd like to think that there was a large struggle for thousands of years to try and establish a system that at the same time as it satisfies our need for belief and our curiosity about answers to these questions that we don't have the answers to, something happens where it gets too strict and it falls apart, or it gets too loose and it falls apart, because we need that structure. But the structure and what it is that we build that structure with, like you're saying, it is so wishy-washy what the perfect way is to appease all people so that we can all make the same decision together. And what happens is you have groups of people that are very decisive and against each other, and we split and we break. And if you had a system that encompassed all of those people, it wouldn't satisfy all of those people, and it's this hard relationship.
Yeah, I think C.S. Lewis has a line about people being snobs for canonicity, and how, like, you know, don't get hung up on the little inconsistencies of the Bible. Just read it as a myth or a story, or however you want to read it at the time, and eventually you'll find your way with it.
Because truly, whoever wrote these things, they were literary geniuses. They knew exactly the games they were playing and all the balls they were juggling at once. So for example, Exodus, the Sunday school version is, God remembered his people, God brought his people out, God put his people through the water, and then when those prideful Egyptians came through, he closed the water on them. Woohoo! But if you read that thing line by line and have something of a sense of, all right, why are they choosing these images? Why are they answering these questions? What is in the mind of the original audience? You start to get this firecrackering of associations made to the polytheism of the day, and how, without saying it, the author is showing how this weird God, this very weird God that you would never find on a hieroglyphic, is going to become Pharaoh. How is that possible? That's subverting everything we know about civilization up to that point. So it's going to get messy, and it's going to bring those gods and twist them and contort them, and it's going to be ugly. Plagues. It's going to sound wrong, and it's going to have erotic metaphors, and it's going to end with less certainty than the beginning. Because again, the point of Exodus is to show that God can't be represented on a hieroglyph, because that was the burden. And everything in the story is to make that point clear. Because if he could be shown on a hieroglyph, then they might as well have stayed in Egypt. So if he's just winged, like we have in Genesis 1, the story will fail. If he can just see that it is good, then he's no better than Ra. But if the Egyptians don't find him highly attractive and worth pursuing out into the desert, like Tiamat, but God is too much for them, that when God pursues them, he overcomes them like a lover, destroying them in pieces, then you don't have all the things a human being needs to feel secure. And because, right, like if your religion, to Will's point, is constraining so much that you can't put all your hope into it, then you'll put the rest of that hope that isn't answered in something else. And then you get cognitive dissonance over time. And you're going to choose one or the other. And you're going to get a very artificial religiosity and a very dark, under the cover outplaying of all the other stuff. So what would it mean to really bring them into alignment? It's going to get messy, and it's going to look weird. And a lot of work will be taken to iron it out so that it's suitable for young people. But I saw yesterday, somebody pointed out in 1910, a fairy tale written for children. It was full of death, and it was full of rotting corpses, and it was very messy. And so I think nowadays, too much is ironed out for whatever reason. We feel as if people can't take the wrinkles. Because just one last thing, it whets my appetite, because I wanted to make the claim that all these books are basically telling the same story with different characters in different places. And kind of like a video game, it spreads out the places so you start to get a sense of, this is a huge...
I think I glitched out there for a minute. I didn't pick up on a lot of that.
Oh, sorry. I'll just recap real quick. The dividing of the waters in chapter 1, big deal. So what? Who knows? It's a cosmological question. In Exodus, it's a repetition. God divided the waters with Moses' hand. And Moses in the original means water, drawn from water. So you got to think about it. The name, which means drawn from the water, is moving out his hand to separate the waters. So that the people who struggle with God, Israel, because that's what Israel means, can pass through as if on dry land. And the Nile was the bread and butter of everything good that happened in Egypt. So the audience knows how important water is. They also know that the gods come from water. And so their hero is drawn from it, and their hero separates it. And their hero is a human like them. So I would say you have the incarnation of the New Testament right there. You don't need the New Testament to follow the logos of the New Testament, because it's the same story.
Yeah, that's a major thing about the Bible and the New Testament compared to any other kind of mythology like Greek or Norse, is the Bible is a story about the people primarily. When you look at Norse mythology, there's not a single person involved. It's just the story of Thor, Odin, and all the other Aesir and the Vanir. Whereas,
tell me more about that. I'm really curious.
Well,
how does it work itself out?
Well, it's more like a cohesive story. Like, it starts at the beginning of the world in Norse mythology, where like everything's frozen over, and eventually it gets melted down a little bit, and then there's giants, or one big giant, and he gives birth to like 3 sons. And I'm a little foggy on it now, but it doesn't mention the people like humans until talks about Midgard, and then it's just like, oh, the people that live in Midgard, we take care of them, and we interact with them a little bit. It has kind of like some similarities to the Bible, where one of the gods will go down to Midgard and he'll make love to some like random individuals, and like he makes a child of the rich people, and then the poor people, and then like the middle class people, and then it's just to show that like everyone in Midgard is related to the gods, but like there's still a bit of discrepancy there. And you obviously see that in Greek mythology. Whereas like Achilles, everyone knows him as a half god, right? Zeus was his father, same with Hercules, and most of the Argonauts have some lineage as the gods, but when you read the Bible, it's like God created them. There is no like extra relationship to that. Like you see the creation myth when Odin and his two brothers create the first two people out of trees, and then Odin breathes life into them, which is kind of similar to one of the origins in the Bible, but there's a lot of differences later on when it just completely neglects the people and then sees them as just like the middle realm that interacts with the heavens in some other kind of fashion.
Well, that spark plugs a connection, what you just said. He has his way with the people, they're cool, and then he leaves them.
Yeah.
Kind of forgets about them. I don't feel in any way blasphemous for saying what I'm about to say. I believe we get a similar concept in the Old Testament. I mean, we follow chosen people very closely, generation by generation after Abraham. And then something happens after Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat. We get a long period of, I don't know where God is, he's gone. And now we are the Egyptians, for lack of a better word, slave. We have enough food, but where'd God go? I don't know. He abandoned us. It has, if I could say that phrase again, baked in a similar concept that the Norse had as well, a similar logos.
Kind of like God only intervenes when he knows you need it kind of thing. Just like the Greek or the Norse gods would only come to defend Midgard from the sea serpent that swims around their realm, or an actual threat that they know that they couldn't handle.
Mm.
In Norse mythology, you're saying that like human race was just kind of created as a thing for whatever reason, whereas in Christianity we have like God has created mankind and he's created the universe, and this is his energy that he's poured into the creation of the world, and they are an extension of his divine existence. And then when you have that detachment where God doesn't show up for 7 years of famine, it hits differently than just being made out of a tree.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because when you're just made out of a tree, you might have in the back of your mind a human being's liturgy is amenable to the season. There are seasons of reaping the fruit, and then there are seasons where you just let the leaf fall. Basically, human beings are like the seasons. But if you're made in the image of God, you have something eternal, and that doesn't conduct itself seasonally. And then to feel the absence of that, you would ask yourself, just like Nietzsche asked in the 19th century, is God dead? Because he left his image.
That's a fundamental problem. Like that right there is where it got so strict that you've got a falling off point there, where now it's, well, if we're made in the image of God and our soul can transcend to heaven, now there's this reliance and this dependency potentially. There's a potential for it, don't get me wrong, but this, when you sort of abstract it and you say, well, the kingdom of heaven and hell are manifest in your life on earth, and that the divinity is in everything, and that God hasn't left us because this entire creation is God, without making that statement become blasphemy, it shifts the perspective to something completely different, where there isn't an abandonment except for in your own doubt and your own fears, and allowing them to become the master of your existence. That would drive you to hell. But when you take away the choice and you say that God is able to intervene and call these shots, it puts us on a completely different plateau.
And I'll be quick with this anecdote, but you inspired it in me when you said that, the plateau. Someone does so many push-ups and they get a certain plateau, and if they just keep doing the same number of push-ups, they're not going to grow anymore. They're not even going to be enlivened to keep going. They're going to drop the liturgy sooner or later. They're going to drop the relationship. I think the tie between a relationship's health and the strength and creativity of the liturgies are very closely aligned. I mean, people can't just get married and then, hey, we'll always look back on that day I saw you walking down the aisle. Yeah, that'll sustain us for 50 years.
Tell me about it. I got married last June.
Hey, congrats, man. We need multiple liturgies stacked, and they have to make sense why one comes after the other. But they also have to be individualized, or there's none of your skin in it. There's just everybody's skin in it, and then it becomes, who cares?
That's why every anniversary has to outdo the last one. It goes from diamond to whatever.
Well, absolutely. So my analogy to that was, a little later on in the Bible, before we come to that quiet intertestamental period before Jesus walks in the world, we have Elijah, and he was a weird one. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, he was the one who sicked a bear on some boys who made fun of him for being bald. He was a prophet not to be toyed with. Now, this was a man of God. So I think we have to get out of our mind this simplistic liturgy of God being benign, because the story was there, and this is the story. He's always passing by this house because he's a prophet, so he's always walking around and mobile, and the woman sees him as a holy man. So she says to her husband, hey, look out the window. You see that guy? Let's entice him. Let's build a little shack next to our house. Let's make some good, scrumptious food and draw him in. They do that. He stays in the house. She's like 7 years old, has no kids. She looks at him. She's waiting at the door in his room. Now, you want to think about this on every single level you can, because they're all true. She's standing at his door. And he looks at her and he says, what do you want? And she says, nothing. Nothing. It's enough to have you in my house. And then he looks at her, just as if God was looking at Sarah, and says, when the season of life comes next year, you're going to have a child. No, I'm 70 years old. Immediately, the next line, she's pregnant, has a child. This is a great thing, but there's a big question mark. How'd she get the child? The prophet leaves, because he's a prophet, and he leaves. And he goes wherever he goes with his best buddy, servant, and they're just hanging out. And she raises her child with her husband. And then the child gets sick because he's got a big headache. So one day he goes out to his biological father in the field. Dad, I got a headache. Oh, I can't look at all this. Oh, collapses. He's so traumatized. He's brought to his mother. The mother holds him in her arms. He dies. She carries him up to the room that the prophet was staying in and lays the child in the prophet's bed. She shuts the door behind her, walks past her husband, gets on a horse, and seeks out the prophet. She comes up to him. The servant steps in front of her and says, what do you want? And she's like, get out of my way. She goes up to the prophet and she grabs his ankle. She wanted to see from every direction. She will not let this go. And she says, "Did I not tell you I didn't want a child?" And he knew the child died. But he doesn't go there himself. He sends his servant with a stick. And he says, "Take this staff in your hand and put it on the forehead of the child, right on his face. And he'll wake up." Again, just symbolism. Doesn't work because it's the servant. And so now Elijah walks in the room, lays on top of the child, breathes on him, puts his hand on his hands, his feet on his feet, his face on his face, and the child starts to warm like he's an embryo. And then, weird line, he goes downstairs, he paces in the living room, and then goes back upstairs and does the same thing. Breath goes into the child wakes up. The prophet looks at the woman and says, "Here's your child." And she's thankful. End of story. The prophet says, God didn't tell me that the child died. He kept it from me. It took you rushing past my servant, grabbing my feet, and yelling at me to get my attention. Last part, fast forward to the New Testament. Again, a very benign story, but we have to see the connection. Jesus is sitting with the Pharisees. He's a holy man. And this woman out of nowhere rushes in and says, "Heal my daughter. Heal her." Jesus, who's this daughter? Why does she feel so entitled to ask for a miracle from you? Jesus says, "She's not mine. Woman, why would you give the children's bread to the dogs?" And then he just dismisses her. She grabs his legs, looks up to him, and says, "The dogs get crumbs from the table, don't they?" And he is blown away. His eyes are open as if he didn't know, and says to her, "Your faith is huge. You'd come all this way and speak that way to a prophet. Let it be done to you as you want. Whatever you want, baby, whatever you want." She goes home, her daughter's healed, end of story.
I think that speaks to another kind of definition of faith or belief, which is trust. And there's a great YouTuber named Paul Vanderklay. I know you have a video with him, Matt. But he has one video where he talks about words that fudge in the Bible, where he talks about belief, where it's not just read the Bible and you have to internalize and take in and truly believe every word on the page. You just have to trust it is a better way to put it. Like when you read critiques about the Bible that are before our time and they use the word faith or belief, and you just substitute it with trust in our English language, it starts to make a little bit more sense. I think, anyway.
One thing I want to bring up, because obviously I know nothing about anything really when it comes to religion. So I was on Wikipedia finding out about this book of Genesis that we're reading. And it turns out, from what I understand, the first 5 books of the Old Testament make up the
Torah?
Torah. There it is. There. I almost had it. And so this notion of Mosaic authorship is one of the tenets of Orthodox Judaism. I don't even think I've ever said half of these words before in my life. And so that's something altogether, again, unknown to me, but this is something that I am bringing up, and have at it, boys.
Yeah, that's just like the 3 Abrahamic religions all use the Old Testament, but the Christianity uses the New Testament and the Old Testament, and then Islam uses bits of the Old Testament and the Quran. I might be wrong, or just pieces of them overlap. I think it's just that the Abrahamic stories are also retold in the Quran.
Religions that you speak of.
And I think you mentioned Paul Vanderklay.
Mm-hmm.
Next to Vanderklay, you have Jordan Peterson. And I think this is where the Orthodox game gets interesting, because we get more card players at table. Peterson is telling a story. In fact, on record, he has said, in one of his more vulnerable moments, the person with the best story wins every time. And so I think we are far less prone to accept arguments than we believe. We are bound to accept stories. And then I would say we're bound to accept stories because a big difference between a story and an argument is a story has liturgies to offer. That next level of engagement, whereas an argument's like an algorithm. You see why it's there, and without it, there would be less certainty. But
Here,
when the computer screen turns on because of the algorithms rightly assembled, it's just like the movie The Avengers. When they all assemble, okay, they're going to fight the bad guy. Things are as they should be. The television screen is turned on. Computer is turned on. But what that doesn't give you is a liturgy of what to do next. It gives you existence. It doesn't give you purpose.
When you look at this distinction between story and argument, you have the notion of when you argue with someone and you say, I have this point that differentiates from your point, the human instinct, that whole event at a subconscious level is being processed as an attack, and it triggers the fight, flight, freeze modality, and you have to defend your position or run away or freeze up, and it happens so quickly. Whereas if you take the exact thing that you're trying to put to this person, let's say you're trying to have them absorb this simple fact about their life, you don't have to do that. You just make a story identical to them. Just change the gender of the person in the story that you're delivering it to, and now all of a sudden you have a hypnotic script, and you're inserting data past the critical faculty, because we can listen to a story, as you've hit on a huge note, is that this is an entire organism based on stories. Stories are how we survive, and when you give information in the story format, it can be wild and exaggerated, and it'll skip right past that part that says, oh, you're wrong, you're telling me what's up, and it'll just go right in and embed in the subconscious layer, no matter what that is. And when you give stories to children, that builds their entire way they process reality. That builds their filters. Those stories and those pieces of information ingrain in their outlook on reality.
Yeah, and like stories and metaphor in the form of argument is so much more useful than just like complaining to them. Like you could say, trust me, man, you go down this hole, you're gonna get some unwanted consequences. Or you could say, hey man, you're opening up a Pandora's box here, and you get your point across much better.
Like, so for me, I have this one friend that we, for probably 7 years now, we really like to debate with each other. And he's very argumentative, and we'll both be on our phones Googling and researching our points and trying to prove each other wrong. And I made this shift a few years ago where I started saying, you know what, if I think so highly enough of this data point, I need to apply it to my own life and then share my context. Because as soon as I start sharing my context about a data point, it's no longer this works and it will work for you. It's I have this experiential thing, this anecdote, and it's worked for me. And they can say, okay, well, that doesn't work for me, and it removes the drop of conflict. And you simply say, okay, well, for me, it has benefit, and that's why I know it's valuable, and that's why I feel confident sharing this with you. But if it's not for you, it's not for you. And it shifts the entire dynamic of discussing points. Because if you're just talking way up here with things that you haven't experienced, you don't actually get anywhere. But when you ground yourself in story and experience and relativity, it's a whole different paradigm.
And exactly, it's a whole new paradigm. It's a new bill of goods. Actually, a very old wineskin. And sometimes old wine is vintage. And sometimes new wine has to go in new wine. So I think prior to Freud giving us a popular conception of psychology, we still had psychology, but it was more narrative based. Whereas Freud did a weird thing. He said, I'm going to collapse all the stories similar to Plato's cave, where there's a real world. Is that music coming through too big?
A little bit.
Let me
not too bad.
unplugging. I'm gonna shut the window real quick. Hold on. All right. So the Plato's cave is a story of the real world and then the not so real, and the truly
one
wise
last year,
person.
right?
What?
I think we hit on the cave last year.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah,
the real
in
and the
our,
not so
in the Republic.
Yeah.
the real and the not so real, and the wise person is distinguished not as what party line they fall on, but their ability to go back and forth. Because the child is going to find themselves chained to a rock, looking at shadow puppets. That's where they are in their development. And a loving father is going to sit down next to them and say, hey, you see that shadow of the long-necked creature? It's a cute giraffe, or it's a hydra. It's actually both. I want to train your eyes to see both, so you can deal with both. And that takes love out of what does it mean? Because right now we're not concerned with defining the word. And in fact, what the Father's trying to convey to the Son at that moment next to the rock is not this word links to that word and the other word, and now you have an inviolable set of definitions that will get you through life. Just like walking down the aisle once doesn't get that person in your arms forever. It's an existential game. And you have to be able to see both sides all the time. So you can't do that by going from word to word in a dictionary. But how do you measure competence in doing that? Very difficult. I think it's impossible. But you know it when you see it. And when you see a father telling a story to his son, I think that's an archetypal image of the process. Not what one person doesn't do it better than another. The whole thing every time is the spirit manifesting. So Freud looked at that, and then he tried to neuter it of all that differentiation of different fathers do it different ways, different sons like different stories, some like baseball, some like basketball stories, whatever. Freud was just like, forget the context. It's all about the fact that he's in a cave. That's what's paramount. And he called that the unconscious. And now he thinks we can all understand propositionally people's developmental arc by talking about Plato's cave. I mean, Freud's unconscious. And when people forget that Freud was just retelling Plato's cave, which was retelling another mythological trope of the two worlds and the wise person straddling both, they think they're doing something very scientific when they're actually doing something very literary.
So that's something that came up actually. We were talking with one of the other members of the Akira server about Mark Manson's book, and this notion that there's this whole school of authors that are constantly, and artists and creators constantly retelling these core truths that are being pulled from Eastern philosophy and Stoicism and mythology. And when you really look at things from a very broad perspective, there's only a handful of stories and a handful of messages people are constantly redelivering and rediscovering, and there is a need for that. But the development of new paradigms and the ability to mesh together and alchemize ancient thought into new gold is something that I think we're trying to do all the time as a human race. Like you look at all of the new religions. I wonder what the statistics are for new religions being formed each decade. And it's hard to do. It's hard to hit on the difference between telling the story you wish it was told, the way you wish it was told, and coming up with a new solution.
That's it. That's it. The dichotomy of solution story. I want to say, I don't think there's any such thing as Christian or agnostic or atheist. I think these are artificial categories that belong with a certain mode of storytelling that is very fragile and not resilient and won't be around in the next 100 years. It got started with the Four Horsemen. And the publishing industry said, hey, there are these diverse group of scientists who are also eloquent, and they have a common enemy. They can help each other sell books, and we can put them next to the Christian section. Which means the only reason those Four Horsemen sold books was they were preying on the audience of the Christians. Now, I don't mean that as a bad thing, but I think that's the only way those books got past the idea phase and received an investment. Now, what that perpetuated was this concept of there is such a thing as an atheist and such a thing as a theist. And now we get people debating, can I be a theist and not a Christian? Can I be a theist but not grounded in any one set of liturgies or practices? Well, maybe I have Spinoza's God, and they start just populating their concept with stuff, which then generates the possibility of debates with an atheist on that level, which is great if you want to make a career out of hosting debates, but it doesn't matter.
That speaks to the need of labels.
Because it doesn't give you in any of those debates or in any of the outcomes. I don't care if the theist wins or the atheist. Whoever wins, they don't give you a box of liturgies. They give you a point score.
Yeah, the worst thing about those debates is the winner loser factor. Like, I wish it was framed much more like just a conversation. That's why I love the Jordan Peterson with Sam Harris debate so much, is because like Sam was a little combative there. I'll admit to that, but like Jordan Peterson was just like, let's just rap about the Bible for an hour and see where it gets us. Like, this is what I think about God. What do you think about God? Well, I think you're wrong about God. That's what I think.
One of the problems that we have as a human race is, especially in North America, like we have this weird culture that says, don't talk to strangers, and then also teaches us about what it means to be the Good Samaritan. And we have labels that are supposed to indicate to us who our groups are. And we've been doing this for thousands of years, for generations upon generations, labeling each other so that it was very easy for us to generalize as we filter reality, who we can trust and who we can be safe in and confide in. And now, especially right now, like this very minute, we have a label universe. And everyone gets to have a label. And everyone's label can be unique because there's identity and there's conforming to the group. And we want our group, we want our clique, but we also want to be unique and have our identity. And with the internet, you can research everything. Whereas even 50 years ago, if you wanted to say, I want to find my label, you only had so many thoughts and so many ideas and so many notions, depending on how small of a town you were in, you maybe didn't have an option. And now we're experiencing this opportunity in human existence to identify what we believe in and what we like, but to the degree we're taking it, it's now separating us again. And we're going to hit this wall where we realize, oh, okay, labels are crap.
Amen. That is so true, because back in the day, pre-depressions, 1930s, if you wanted information, you had to go knock on grandmother's door. Yeah. And before she was going to tell you a story, you had to present some sugar or maybe pull up some weeds. In other words, win-win scenario. Families do this all the time. Oh. So you got far more than information. You got an ethic. I'm not saying the ethic was right. I'm not saying the ethic was wrong, but it came with the package. Now, to your point, Will, you can go on Wikipedia, and with the simple sacrifice of scrolling up, you get all the bullet points you could ever need to sound like someone else.
Links to take it another direction.
And to think that's a sacrifice that most people aren't willing to make in this day. Like,
but the loss of the ethic, I think, goes hand in glove. I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything like this, but economically, we're feeding the machine with our preferences and with our clicks. And to feed the machine means allowing data to come from all different directions to then be compressed into decisions. And typically those decisions are interpreted as consumer purchasing power, which then can be sold as high quality data on your audience's desire. The only problem is, who knows, since it's an average, it's not an existing individual. And so this desire that people spend a lot of money, Dove soap, Hollywood, appealing to audiences are appealing to something that doesn't actually exist, but is an average over a number of very minuscule, unimportant clicks people make without any ethic attached to them. So I was sitting at a bar, and a friend of mine from Georgia came to California, and he's a independent software developer. He's worked with a number of technology companies, and he just said off the cuff after drinking some beer, you know, it's a very insidious thing Google does. I'm not saying it's evil, but it's insidious. They do everything within their power to make you stay on screen a millisecond faster than you normally would. Why? Because when you add up all those milliseconds, you get a minute. And that minute is very valuable when 100 million people are on for a minute. Now, that minute can be guaranteed because of the little hamster in the wheel psychology things that are baked into the algorithms, little data points, the way the screen looks, its colors, its framing, A/B testing.
Like when you're scrolling through Facebook and it starts auto playing a video, oh, I might as well keep staring at this for another 5 seconds instead of going on my merry way.
And it's benign from your perspective because it's a second. But when you add up those seconds, you get a minute. Now Facebook can sell that minute of guaranteed attention for $1 billion to all these different companies that can put their Dove soap on the side. Now, when there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't do anything to you in particular as a consequence. But when that becomes the norm of doing business, we're feeding this machine that can make such highly probabilistic decisions before anything happens that we start to get our own wish fulfillment. And we start to think we know more about what people are going to do before they even act, which means we're writing history before history happens, which means we're psychologizing people based on unimportant decisions made without an ethic of walking next to grandma and hearing a story, which means we're becoming anti-human. And I don't know what that's going to look like played out. But it's not going to look like anything human, and that's the problem.
Absolutely. So you just opened another can of worms, which is this perpetuation of this economy that is consumer driven. Right now we have the same cartoons on television that we've had on television for almost 30 years. We're making the same movies, we're rebooting the same games, and we're trying to sell to everyone we can possibly sell to. And what happens is you halt progress, because if the machine can sell, it means nothing's changing. If everybody's still listening to the same Billboard Top 100 chart hits made by the same group of 5 people writing all of the music, and we have franchises now where you can walk into a Walmart in any state and go to the same aisle that you would in any other Walmart because it's all the same. We're shutting down innovation, we're shutting down creativity, and we're freezing human progress to the point that something very bad will happen. And it horrifies me. But that's a whole can of worms right there.
And it's all based on producing content that they know people will flock towards. It's like, oh, I'm a Star Wars fan. I'm gonna go see Episode 9.
I mean, it's such a distasteful view of humanity, because, all right, they want Star Wars, we'll give them Star Wars. 9 years later, you're assuming that these people haven't changed in 9 years. Let's just give them a bunch of nostalgic flashback without any real character motivation or arc in the new movies, because that'll satisfy them. It's all they want. They just want to see what they've already seen. I mean, you might as well call them what you're thinking. It's now, I don't think consciously the people who make the choices think that about their audience, but the actions speak for themselves. Innovation is the highest compliment you can pay a human being, because you're then assuming, I have to innovate because my audience is growing.
Yeah, if you're assuming that you have an undiscerning clientele that isn't interested in being on the edge, because like right now the biggest game release that I'm excited about is the reboot of Final Fantasy VII, and it's
yeah.
I mean, why wouldn't you be? We're all suckers for it because we know it and we're comfortable with it and familiar with it. And you can make the argument, look, we are rebooting content, but in the new medium, and technology is moving forward and creating the supply and making the demand for the product creates funding for the technology to move forward and give R&D funds potential. Yeah, sure, there's this intricate machine. But on the surface, it's very easy to be critical of it because it doesn't look different, because it still looks like all of my friends from high school are still playing Call of Duty, and that doesn't seem to be solving the wars on the other side of the world.
No, exactly. And I really think this is important. I think this is one of the gifts Peterson gave us. He modeled what it looks like to really care about a problem. He didn't give us solutions. He gave us story, but he was willing to tell a story with so much passion and tears in the latter part of his world tour. I would say because he really thought that the problem he was addressing mattered. So for example, yeah, we're in a consumerist society. We get a lot of reboots. I can put that in a nice little corner of my world and live the rest of my life with vigilance and innovation, right? Wrong if you want to take the problem seriously. If you want to take the problem seriously, you have to see that's actually a drag corner. And if I turn my face from it, it's going to grow, and it's going to eat my house, and it's going to eat my friends and family, and then it's going to eat me after it's taken one of my legs off and watches me tremble in pain and agony. Because every year we don't get something new is a year where we think we can have another year where we don't get something new. And that builds like water against the levees until that proverbial you're 52 years old and you realize, I haven't had my Abrahamic journey yet. It's someone's fault.
Rituals in this country. We do not have a clear point for the average young man to enter manhood anymore. Tribes, cultures, religions, societies, countries, they've all been doing it for thousands of years. But for the past 100 years in North America, we have been losing it. We have been creating a society where boys don't become men.
Yeah,
take that however you like.
And we look at something like Plato's Republic when he tried to make the perfect state, where he's like, well, the rearing of children and the importance of tradition is obviously number one priority. Like, we don't think the same way they did a couple thousand years ago.
And I want to tie this in with why I believe the Bible is the same story retold with different cast members. I think it is part of this innovation problem with respect to rites of passage. If the word of God is infallible in the sense that once it's spoken, it's in stone, your job is to accept it no matter what you feel. If you feel something different, you're sinning. Get over it. That's close to saying get over yourself, which is close to being anti-human in the sense that let the machine take over for you. Let the Bible's already been written. Don't think anymore. Like there's a real connection subterraneously between fundamentalist anything and letting the machine stand in our way. Now, the Bible, I would say it's got the same logic, but it's told in different ways because every generation has the problem of what Peterson would say is bringing their father out from the belly of the whale. Everything was good. I mean, obviously it was in the last generation. We're here. They found a way to get married, to be stable enough to introduce children into the world and take care of them. They succeeded miraculously. I mean, it's a miracle when reproduction happens and children grow up and you can have a passing of the guard. It is a miracle. Now, how were they sufficiently motivated? Did their grandfather give them Genesis chapter 1? I don't think so. But
yeah,
that's
such
I
an
really
important point. Like that's
Yeah.
what I think Genesis, specifically Noah's Ark, is all about, is like the bottleneck of humanity. Like how people, like the population of the planet has gone up and down like crazy to a point where there's probably just a handful of people left on the planet at a given time. And then they had to go from there. They had to figure out their way forward. They had to populate the earth, you know, spread among the country and spread your seed among the earth, you know. Like they had to figure out how to do it on their own. And then they wrote down how they did it. But we never got to the point in the story where, you know, everyone's got internet and we're all trapped inside. We're trying to figure out what to do during a pandemic and how to save the world from ourselves, basically. How do we reunite the Orthodox and the Catholics? How do we get the atheists to stop yelling at the Christians and saying, "There's no sky, Daddy, leave it alone"? Like, there's too much conflict, and it seems like it should be easy to unite over something. But I just don't know what that is. I don't think it's Christ. I don't think it's the Bible or any other religion or cultural change. But it's got to be something.
It's credit due somewhere to be able to ask these questions now.
Yeah, exactly. You have to be thankful to people like Thomas Aquinas for, like, we're allowed to question the Bible because of the contribution of the Apostle Paul and the writers of the New Testament and the Old.
Exactly. And in that point, I think one of the rites of passage in our generation is it's a combination of forgiveness and, for men, to hell with it mentality. If it's pointed in the right direction. I think it's both, because we have to forgive what happened in the 70s and 60s. We have to forgive that Nietzsche wrote, "Thus spoke Zarathustra." We have to forgive that religion is not clean and tidy anymore. There are schisms everywhere. We have to forgive that the mega churches happened in the 90s, and people forgot that they weren't in a wartime setting doing psyops on people. They're pastors in a church of 2000. Like, we have to forgive all of that baggage brought to what it now means for us to raise families. Because that's where the rubber meets the, like, that's where we actually establish our kingdom. Like, it's the most significant thing we'll ever do.
Absolutely. Like, there's no building the future if we have all these different groups of people wanting to dredge up the past. The past is terrible.
Yeah.
It's awful and so fantastic.
Forgive, but don't forget. That's the important part, I think. Because, like, we were talking about this in one of our last podcasts, I think, where, you know, we had the Holocaust, we had World War II, the Germans lost World War II, we beat the Nazis, but there's still Germans. So what do we do about that? We have to remember the lessons that we learned from the catastrophes of the 20th century, but that doesn't mean we have to hold a grudge over them all.
And then I think without holding that, and yet we've got to do something with our energy. So yes, don't hold grudges, articulate to ourselves what happened in a way that works now as we're progressing to the next liturgy. So for example, like I'm a fan of the idea when you're in your 20s, explore, have your Abrahamic journey, go places, even if you can't geographically go in your mind, go read books, go say the stupid thing to people so that you're called a fool. It's better to be called a fool.
Yeah.
Because then you have in your guts the feeling of what it's like to be called out. It's good. You can't get that from a textbook. You can't get that from being pious. So then when you become pious, you know the difference, and you're both. You can see both. So when like your girlfriend is maybe like pious, you're like, oh, that's awesome because you were pious. Or if they're like struggling with the patriarchy, you're like, I totally get that. Because you can actually have empathy, right? Like, because you've done both. You're not sterile. You've lived. And then when it comes time to settle down, you can actually settle down authentically. And I think so much of that is missed because college in and of itself doesn't allow for that kind of becoming a fool. You're catered to like a consumer. You can go see the football game. You can have a reduced price on your nice steak. You can go to the library. You can have an exception on your homework assignment, blah, blah, blah. And then you walk out and you feel like, man, I'm basically a CEO with my degree. No, you're not, man. You're going to be answering phones for 4 years.
Yeah, and you've never presented your ideas to anybody, so you've never been corrected by anybody, so you're never going to understand the holes in your own theory.
And to the point we made earlier, it's not about winning an argument. Being corrected does not mean you are shown that you are wrong in an eternal calculus of who's right. It's that now you have in your guts the liturgy or the story of what it felt like to be corrected. Now you can pass that story on. You can even participate on the other side in the future with good faith and not like an ass, you know?
Like, or maybe you weren't wrong. Maybe you just had a really bad argument and you have to sharpen it a little bit to be able to actually convince someone down the road.
Exactly. Or maybe you're right and it's time to stand up, even if you're 21. Like, you don't know until you do it. Now you're going to have your Luther moment where you're like, here I stand. But now you get to have it as Matt Allison or Will or Rugmo, you know, and you're free from the past. You don't have to be pious. You're deeply pious. You don't even need the story. You've done it. You got the t-shirt. So now that's what I meant by have that to hell with it attitude as the man. It's like we're supposed, like the next generation won't happen without us. So we have to be willing to die. And we're not in a war, so I think it means we have to be willing to give up our identities for what we perceive as the greater good. And I really, as a deep believer in God, I think that's exactly where God meets us and makes it so that we don't die, actually. But we actually get a blessing, like a real reward for that. And then we get to move forward. And the best part is you don't have to pay for it. But it's difficult to put that in words and make it a rite of passage. And I'm not saying all that was to say now become Eastern Orthodox and go to parish. It's not that simple. Because, man, I started going to an Eastern Orthodox parish, and I'll tell you what, a lot of bad things happen. Like, there is spiritual warfare. It is real. I went through 2 different churches trying to go through my catechumen process, and first time I had to move, second time I had to leave parish because there were some bad things going on. That's not supposed to happen in the house of God. But it does, because the world is the world. And so just because you have a noble aim doesn't mean you won't be tested and tried. And actually, I'm very thankful for it, because it kind of lets me realize that it's not enough to tell someone go to church. That's not even the beginning. So I'm exacerbating the problem you brought up. How do we put this in a thing that people can touch and see and hold as a liturgy, or better, a set of liturgies to get them through? I think in our day and age, a lot of it is person-to-person meetups and anything that will get us away from the Wikipedia small sacrifice scrolling up of points. We need to get into that mode where we're knocking on doors with sugar to get our information. Video games. Maybe you could bring video games into this, because on one level, video solitary activity, like reading the Bible, is a solitary activity. But video games, I think, can be used to bring people in contact, real contact with real consequences.
It's a story medium, right? Depending on how far the developers take it. But like from my own experience, like today, my wife wanted to make a stew, and she brought home a rutabaga, and she thought it was a turnip. And I played Harvest Moon, and it's not pink, and it doesn't look like a turnip. And I know that it's not a turnip. I've never grown a turnip. I haven't seen a turnip, but I know what a turnip is. And in fact, I know what hundreds of things are, thousands of things are, because of video games. And there's a choice that developers need to make, and they are constantly making, to impart knowledge wherever attention goes to. And I think that's the thing.
That's a beautiful anecdote. I believe that crystallizes what I was going for, because it allowed you to get out of the game, but you used that time in the same way a farmer in the 1930s would have walked back from the field. And so it's not privileging, oh, let's go back and be basic again, which is just an ideology, but it's using the spirit of that wisdom in a real concrete way that improved that you. And so that story is everything I was trying to say.
Yeah, like what's the appeal of Farming Simulator? You get to experience life as a farmer. You get to simulate it for a bit.
How many new questions are we going to be able to ask once every single child has done a farming simulator and a horse simulator and a debate simulator and a chess simulator, and all of these modalities and styles of existence are just imprinted and part of the manual? Where does it leave us when we can Google the answer to all of our current questions that are being taught in school? What do we teach next? And what is the big innovation that you can't get a Google answer for right now?
I think you just hit the nail on the head. That old idea of, where's the oracle? Let's go ask the oracle. The oracle doesn't go anywhere. The oracle is Buddha sitting in the lotus position. Google. I remember when I was doing research at a university years ago, the professor who was my mentor called it the Google God. And I think he was apt, because that's basically, it was a monotheistic, sitting in place oracle. But that doesn't give you a set of liturgies to teach you what to do next. But when you reference these simulators, now you have an engagement. You have a field of choice where you model liturgies, and then you can unplug at will, which means you have the responsibility of deciding, what am I going to use this for and for how long? And when, most importantly, when does it become no longer beneficial? And then I get to say no. And if I keep saying yes, I'm bordering on addiction. But I get to define those parameters. Whereas if it's just a simple ask Google a question, none of that comes into play. So I think we're onto something with simulator.
So now here's another quick one. Another game that I love playing is Unturned, and it's a zombie survival game. And I think it's a good thing to bring up right now, because a lot of people, probably the majority of people, when COVID-19 came out in North America, were not prepared. At the same time, running parallel to a series like Doomsday Preppers on Netflix, where there's a small group of people who are freaked the hell out about random things and are prepared. We don't have knowledge. We don't have those answers. People don't know how long a roll of toilet paper lasts them. And when you look at a survival game that forces you to drink water every 15 minutes in game, to the point that you get off and realize, I need a lot of water to do anything, that stuff translates. You start to realize, especially with a game where it's like, if I want to put a light on in the middle of the night, I need a power source, I need wiring, I need a light source, I need to figure out what all of that means and where to get all of those things. And I mean, you've got lots of people trying to teach these lessons, like the zombie survival guy, that a decade ago, right? And there's all of these different things that people are trying to share and are now so easily accessed that it's going to put us in this completely different plateau.
Absolutely. And then I'm going to have to go, gentlemen. But before I do, I just want to say that this has been fun.
Yeah, it
I
has.
should do it
I just have one more point, just
Yeah.
to what you were saying, Will. Rewind that, 2 to 6,000 years, and the only thing we have like that in the story verse is the Bible. Like, that's the only extra thing that they could experience, like a video game that was a simulation of someone else's life. So, like, just the age of these stories, where it was the only thing available, it really is a testament to how far we've come as a species.
It's crucial to remember that the brain doesn't differentiate between the story and reality. So you do get the lessons.
Yeah.
It teaches you that there's no distinction. You read the story, you learn at a subconscious level. Go ahead, Matt.
No, absolutely. But I think Will brings up a very good threshold here, where yes, the brain doesn't know the difference because it's patterns all around. However, things do become obsolete. And in the same way, I don't remember Canadian philosopher who coined this phrase. Peterson has echoed him time and time again. I think Colin McCullen, something like this, where the medium is the message.
Oh, Marshall McLuhan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is really important to keep in mind because the stories are the stories, but the Bible is a book. Like, I agree with you, it's a library, but that's conceptual. When you look at the thing as medium, you have a book. And a book has its positives and its negatives, limited as a medium. And its message is just what that medium has. It has nothing to do with the stories. And in terms of engaging someone, a book can engage one person at most. At most, whoever's willing to listen to a guy read from a book. But video games also, like they're more open, but they also are limited. Everything's limited. So the movies used to be a place where people went to get something bigger than a book, but I see movie theaters now becoming the opera house of our time. It's the place to go and see something spectacular, but it's a guilty pleasure and it's very decadent. I mean, you're paying $20 to see something you could see on Netflix. And so there's this virtue signaling there, which I think is great in the same way the opera is virtue signaling. But falling prey to it has to be shown in a certain way, it has to come with a certain package, or it's unfaithful, I think is a big mistake. And as things become obsolete more and more quickly, I think we're going to see that mistake played out a lot faster and a lot more often in our lives. But because we know that, we can get on top of it.
I'll end on this because that's the thing. And there's the distinction between the medium, the message, the story, and the impact. And so all four of those things coming into play, this is my final note here. What are we getting out of the medium of global pandemic? And what are the messages? Because the amount of people experiencing this story right now is through the roof. And the audience is huge. And the messages are multitude. And it is changing the world. And when this ends, if it ends, the economy is going to explode. And there's going to be results from this experience that we are all currently exposed to.
Yeah, that's pretty important. The world isn't what we think it is.
We've got people telling stories and trying to control the message, and that again is their message, because what they do supersedes what they say, and those that don't do are saying something as well.
Now that's a good note to end on. Brilliant. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Until next time, check us out, YouTube, Anchor, bookwave.club. Stay safe, stay 6 feet away from us.
Yeah.
Yeah. I look forward to Exodus, Matt. This has been really good, Matt and Scott.
Yes,
Likewise, you guys.
absolutely. And
Hey, take care.
as an atheist, God bless.
I'll
Take
accept.
care.
Bye-bye.